The Packers are coming off their bye week, and that means the sky is falling for some people. Why? This bye week narrative is just wrong. It's not just overblown, it's wrong. Plus, our old pal Mike Renner is our new pal Mike Renner on the Locked On Podcast Network. Now, one of the co-hosts with us here, he talks about the Packers youth movement, Jordan Love's development, and one player from this upcoming draft class he might like to see in green and gold. All of that on today's show.
You are Locked On Packers, your daily Green Bay Packers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Packers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Peter Bukowski, and I cover the Packers for The Leap, a newsletter I would love for you to subscribe to. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you find podcasts, you will find Locked On Packers, the number one Packers podcast on the internet, and the show for fans who know what happened. They want to know why and how. Thanks to everyone who makes Locked On Packers their first listen every day. We hope you like starting your day with us as much as we like starting our day with you. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at the Game Time app. Create an account and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Our pal Mike Renner on the show today. Now, the host of Renner Ranks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, of course. He is an NFL draft extraordinaire. So we're going to talk about some of the young players on this Packers team, the approach that they've taken with all of these young guys, and a name or two that, we might be looking at in the draft that he just might have his eye on. Just someone to flag. That's coming up a little bit later on Locked On Packers. We're going to start with this bye week stuff. And by this bye week stuff, I mean a narrative that has dogged Matt LaFleur. And I remember it being a discussion last year when they came out and just handled the LA Rams post-bye. It started, and I understand it, it started in 2019. They come out of the bye week and they get their pants pulled down by the 49ers. Here's the thing. They played the 49ers later in that season, and what did they do? They pulled the Packers' pants down. It had nothing to do with when that game was being played. The Packers were just not in the same league with the 49ers. And more than that, they were a horrible matchup for that 49ers team. That would have been true in week 1, in week 8, in week 17, in week 25. It did not matter. The next year, they get their pants pulled down by Tampa Bay. Okay, now, part of this narrative is that they come out of the bye week starting slow. Well, they came out and scored on their first 2 drives against Tampa. So you can't use that. They just couldn't sustain it, and they end up getting blown out. Well, what happened in the NFC Championship game? It's 21-10 at halftime. It's 28-10 after the first possession of the third quarter when the Packers fumble and the Bucs punch it in. That game is over at that point. The Packers don't even make it to 28. The Bucs get to 31. And that had nothing to do with the bye week. That was the NFC Championship game. And that's the point. That Bucs team was just better than Green Bay that season in terms of matchup. I thought they were pretty even teams, but that was the year. If the Packers have a healthy team, you'll never convince me the Bucs win that game. If David Bakhtiari plays, the Packers win, you'll never convince me otherwise. Okay. But what those two examples miss is in order to get to those games, they had to play playoff games. Playoff games. The Packers have had 3 bye weeks in the postseason. They are 2-1 in those games. And in fact, 2 of them are 2 of the greatest games Matt LaFleur has ever called, that he has ever game planned. A magnificent plan against Seattle. They come out hot. They've got a 2-score lead at halftime against Seattle. Now, they couldn't sustain it in the second half. Seattle comes roaring back. They were a good team. Russell Wilson in his mostly prime. Pete Carroll, that's a really good football team. They came out flying. Unscouted stuff to Tyler Ervin. They had a whole package with Tyler Ervin, and it worked. They had specials to Devontae Adams. It was magnificent. And it took Aaron Rodgers with a little prestidigitation at the end of that game. A beautiful throw to Jimmy Graham, a beautiful throw to Devontae Adams to steal it. But that started with Matt LaFleur game plan. Because that's got to be the problem here. If you have a problem, is that Matt LaFleur is somehow the common denominator here, right? And so then you go to 2020. They come out against the best defense in the league, Aaron Donald, Jalen Ramsey, and they put together a terrific game plan. They stay patient. They run the ball effectively, and they had a shot play. They were so confident it was going to work. They were so right it was going to work. They threw it twice. It worked twice, and Allen Lazard dropped it the first time. He dropped it. They went back to it, and it worked again. And it scored the game-clinching touchdown. It was a beautiful Matt LaFleur tapestry that was painted in that game. And oh, by the way, the last two regular seasons, 21 and 22, they have won their two games post-bye against, yes, bad teams by a combined 27 points. Now, if you want to talk about the NFC divisional round, when they had the bye, that had nothing to do with the divisional round. Again, you're playing a San Francisco 49ers team that, as we've established, is just a bad matchup for the Packers. They're just not built to beat that team. And by the way, they had a 2-score lead in that game that they blew because the special teams was an abject disaster. Had nothing to do with the bye week. They weren't going to fix it over the bye. They hadn't fixed it all season. You want to have conversations about some of the hiring decisions that were made by Matt LaFleur with Sean Menenga and Mo Drayton? Like, absolutely, let's have those conversations. But it has nothing to do with the bye week. One of the reasons why I wanted to bring this up is because I got a lot of pushback when I pointed out that this Denver Broncos defense is historically bad. Historically bad. Look at the DVOA numbers. You look at 30 and 31, and the Broncos are 32nd in pass defense DVOA and overall defense DVOA. No one is close. Even the other teams that are bad and really bad, like the worst teams, are nowhere near as bad as the Broncos. And so you can say, oh, but the Raiders. Well, the Raiders are trending up. In fact, they played pretty good defense the last 2 weeks. They're now, I believe, 22nd in DVOA. They're trending up. You know what the Broncos were in DVOA last week? 32nd. You know what they were the week before that? 32nd. You know what they were the week before that? 32nd. This has been the worst defense in the league basically all season. And they just cut one of their best players. So this is, if the Packers offense doesn't play well, it will not be because of the bye. And it will not be because I jinxed them by mentioning they were really bad. The Raiders were a below average defense. The Packers offense did not play well against them. If the Packers offense does not look good, it will be only because this is an offense that is volatile and it's got a lot of young players and they're going to play inconsistent football. The Packers could absolutely do to Denver what they did to Chicago, and that is score 30. They could absolutely do to Denver what they did to Atlanta, and that is for a quarter or two look awesome. Really 3 quarters, they looked pretty good. If they do to Denver what they did to, let's say, New Orleans and not look good for 3 quarters, then you start to have a problem. But this is not a bye week thing. And the Broncos are just straight up bad. Like historically bad. Historically bad defense DVOA through 5 weeks, through 6 weeks, through 4 weeks. Pick. Historically bad. One of the worst defenses we have ever seen. It's not comparable to the Raiders. And if the Packers don't exploit it, it will not be because of the bye week. And it won't be because, oh, we said this about the Raiders, blah, blah, blah. No, it's not even close to comparable. What the Broncos are is historic. We should be able to walk and chew gum. One version of bad is not the same as another version of bad. Like the Packers offense against the Saints was bad, but they won because they played great in the fourth quarter. And they net out like kind of meh. pretty good, in fact, in the fourth, like awesome in the fourth quarter, but like pretty overall. It's different. And we should be able to say it's different. And we're going to talk about the reasons that they might be inconsistent moving forward. And that is the youth with our pump, Mike Renner, here coming up on Locked On Packers. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at BetterHelp. There's always an opportunity to be a better version of ourselves. Do you ever feel like your brain is getting in its own way? Like you know what you should do, what's good for you, but you sometimes can't do it. Therapy helps you figure out what's holding you back so you can work for yourself instead of against yourself. You lie in bed thinking about all of the issues that you're facing. You feel like you need to quiet your mind, but you can't find a way. BetterHelp can help. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Make your brain your friend with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp.com/LockedOn. And today's episode is brought to you by our friends at DoorDash. DoorDash, sometimes you just need a timeout. Just enough time to order DoorDash. 2-minute warning, DoorDash. Halftime, DoorDash. Time to pull out your lucky charm and order your favorite apps and snacks on DoorDash because it's football time again. Why root for your team on an empty stomach? Order on DoorDash and save on football watch party favorites. Order pizza, wings, soda, burgers, or even buns on DoorDash and get it all delivered without missing the game. You can DoorDash grocery delivery. Get 50% off, up to $10 when you spend $15 or more on your first order when you download the DoorDash app and enter code LOCKED23. That's subject to terms do apply. That's code LOCKED23 for 50% off, up to a $10 value on your first order when you download the DoorDash app and spend $15 or more. Subject to change and terms do apply. Football season is here and Locked On is kicking up our coverage with Locked On NFL Kickoff Live. Each Friday, Locked On will go live at 2 p.m. Eastern on every Locked On NFL YouTube channel. Hosts Tanitra Batiste, Jarvis Davis, and Kyle Krabs will break down every game of the NFL slate and get you ready for your team's matchups, your fantasy lineups, your betting angles, and more. Plus, get the in-depth local analysis from our stable of NFL hosts across the country who know these teams better than anyone else. Find Locked On NFL Kickoff Live every Friday at 2 p.m. East on any local NFL YouTube channel that includes Locked On Packers. Joining me now, a return guest on Locked On Packers, but for the first time since he's joined the Locked On Podcast Network, our pal Mike Renner. And Mike, let's start there. Tell us about Renner Ranks.
Yes, it's a new daily pod. Obviously, it's on the Locked On Network, but it's just every day ranking something different. Obviously, from my draft background, a lot of it's going to be draft focused, rookie player evaluation type focus, but do a lot of different stuff. Like today, Mondays, I do the all 22 takeaways every Monday. So just basically things that I saw throughout the week that I thought were interesting, that were worthwhile. So that's basically the gist of it.
I can't wait to dig into that for sure. And so let's talk about the draft. We're gonna hold that for the end because I think there's already some Packer fans who might have their eye on the draft a little bit here.
Too early.
Given how the last 2 weeks have gone, I agree, too early. Let's talk about that, though. One of the things that I have been focused on over the last few days is this plan of saying, hey, let's put all these young guys together and just have everyone figure it out. And it looked cool for a couple of weeks and has looked far less cool the last 2 weeks. So let's start from the plan itself. What do you think of that plan? What did you think of it in the spring when you realized, oh, I guess this is just the team they're going to roll with?
It's interesting. You know, they didn't go like the Panthers route where you go sign an Adam Thielen or like an established veteran to try to bring in and like maybe get these guys on the same page. And I think you're seeing the results of that, and that there's no veteran guy getting everyone. Like there's a lot of mistakes, just like mental mistakes, wrong routes, not on the same page. And that's just how the way of the world when you do have that many young guys. But I also think then you're also seeing like a lot of sort of cream rising. There's going to be a lot of competition when you have a lot of first and second year guys. There's not like an inbuilt hierarchy. There's just whoever steps up, whoever plays the best is the one who's going to get the targets, going to get the playing time. So I think it's good from that perspective. And that's really going to get you from like a pure developmental perspective. It's a lot of sink or swim. So I think you're really seeing, the developmental aspect. These guys are really having to get up to speed or else they're not going to be seeing the football field.
Yeah, what is fascinating to me is, and a part of it is my blinders covering this team every day, is in the past when a rookie has come in and popped, you go, oh, this is really cool. And you see around the league, receivers especially are able to come in right away and contribute. But when you're asking so many of these young guys, if Jaden Reed has 2 or 3 missed assignments a game, and Luke Musgrave has 2 or 3 missed assignments a game, and Ben Sims has 2 or 3 missed assignments a game, and Dontavian Wicks, all of a sudden, it looks very different. And I'll speak for myself. I underestimated the impact that would have on the consistency of this team. How have you, now that we've been able to see it through 6 weeks, how have you found this? I've been calling them the Brat Pack, the Baby Packers. How have you found this experiment?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, is that just you can stomach 1 or 2 guys that are in that boat. But then when everyone is, it's just like it's too many plays. It becomes too many plays a game. And you're just going to struggle you're going to look what the Packers offense looks like, where it's like one half, they get 2 first downs. I was at that Lions game. They had 2 first downs. It's one of the worst they looked in the first half. In the second half, third quarter, it's like, oh, wow, they actually can move the ball. It's like, how do these happen? How do you square it away? Like, I just think you're going to deal with the inconsistencies until, the season wears on and everyone kind of gets used to it and gets their assignments down pat. But I do think that they also kind of like drafted guys who were somewhat inconsistent at college too, in terms of like their hands. They drafted a lot of guys with like suspect-ish ball skills. And I think they're paying for that too, where you have a lot of potential plays that have been out there, like catch point down the football fields, that they just haven't consistently made, sadly.
Yeah, and that's not just this draft class. Most recently, it is the draft class before that. We know about some of the famous drops of Christian Watson, but Romeo Doubs at the end of that Raiders game had a chance. Little 8-yard gain would have been a really nice situation to be in, 2nd and 2, and he drops it. Luke Musgrave, next play, he drops it. So these are just sort of the headaches that you live with here. I have been struck with the play of Rasheed Walker, someone who, if I recall correctly, you and Pro Football Focus liked much more as a draft prospect than the league ended up liking him. And part of that was not just football, it was coachability. There were some other of these question marks here. But what have you seen from him? Because I think he's someone that has surprised a lot of fans, albeit again, last couple of weeks has not played quite as well.
Yeah, I mean, Nyman, like they've way outplayed what you would expect for 7th rounders, right? But at that same time, it's like, are they, high-end starters just yet? No, like you're still like they're better than what you expected, but still not quite like where you want to be from like a pure starting left tackle in the NFL. But that's, still early on, super early on in his career. To me, he was a guy who his tape was honestly better like sophomore year at Penn State, going back to like, he was a guy who has all the sort of tools, like, tackle is such like a traits driven position in terms of just like, you got to hit thresholds. And that's why they have like the arm length, the size, but like you gotta, because there's only so many guys 6'5" with that size who can move. And he's one of them who moves like NFL tackles move. And I think it's really encouraging that he's gone from this guy who was super inconsistent at Penn State. And like I said, honestly got worse over the course of his career, to a guy who's turned that around. And so I'm encouraged by what I've seen. It's still like, he's still like does have issues with his hand usage, still can lose quickly to where, you obviously would love to have David Bakhtiari, but like he needs to still get a little bit better.
Yeah, you mentioned that going back to his sophomore year tape part of it, and this past draft class, it seemed like every single player they took, it's like, no, go back to the 2 years ago tape, and you see it, and that was especially true of someone like Dontavian Wicks, where if you just watched his 2021 tape, you're like, whoa, like there's no way this guy is a 5th round pick. How do you square some of that stuff? Because I feel like, especially at positions like, I think tackle is one of them, receiver is certainly one of them, where we look at breakout age, for example, you go, okay, when this guy was 20, he was a killer, but then either they become more inconsistent or they don't take that next step. Like when you're evaluating these guys, how do you square some of that stuff?
Yeah, honestly, like you'd rather a guy be good early though, right? Like I
think so. Yeah.
I'm more willing to buy into the guys who were good early and then have like a reason why they took a step back than maybe the guy who didn't make an impact at all until he was like redshirt senior. And then all of a sudden, like light switch came on. But like, when a guy does have that, you have to almost find the reasons why it didn't go well, right? Whether it's supporting cast, whether it's who the quarterback was throwing the football, other things like that. You got to find those reasons. And then also, like, it helps to be able to talk to them. I used to be able to interview a lot of guys, don't get to do it anymore. But I do think when you do hear guys talk about their game, you can get a sense of where they, are they pointing the finger at everyone else for why they didn't produce? Or are they saying, I have to go back to the drawing board and do it better than I did? So I think that's a big part of it too. But I think the Packers obviously see that guys who produce earlier on in their careers, there's an innate skill to that, or innate talent. It speaks to an innate talent level that they can get to. And they obviously think that with the coaches they have on staff, their developmental staff, that they can bring that back out of them.
All right, more with our conversation with Mike Renner here in just a second on Locked On Packers. You shouldn't have to worry when you're buying tickets to your next big event. That's where Game Time comes in. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all of the sports, music, and comedy near you. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, clutch, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. They've got deals on tickets right up to the start of an event, even an hour after it starts. That's great for like when the NCAA tournament. You've got a day of games. Someone might buy tickets early. They might not have tickets later. They might want to sell them. Hey, bang. Game Time has you covered. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. That's an account at Game Time. How else are you going to take advantage of this great deal if you don't have an account? Got to go make one. Locked On NFL is the promo code for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets at the lowest price guaranteed. And thanks for making Locked On Packers your first listen every day. Every day is tomorrow on the show. Our pal Lily Zhao is with you. We've got our crossover Thursday coming. And then, very excited, Chris Harris from the Denver Broncos, former Denver Bronco, great former All-Pro, one of the best corners of his generation, joins me on Friday. We're going to talk about the 2015 game that became a template for Aaron Rodgers and a lot more. I can't wait to talk to him about this Packers secondary, about Jerry Alexander. It's going to be a fun time. Don't miss that one. And they, certainly with offensive line and receiver in particular, they have a track record doing this. I think you could add corner on this list, even if the coaches have changed over time. They've been able to develop talent there. One of the guys for whom this is true, where you go back and you look at the early tape and go, this guy was awesome, and then things kind of fell apart. How about Jordan Love? And these last 2 weeks, I think often of a conversation we had on this show with Gary Anderson, who was Jordan Love's coach, his second season as a starter at Utah State, and was like, he lost all his guys, and he was out there just feeling like he had to go make plays every time because he wasn't sure if guys were going to be in the right place, if his protection was going to hold up. And that in some ways is comforting, but in some ways makes me nervous because I'm like, well, we know Jordan Love in those situations can get a little loose with the ball, all those kinds of things. So where are you right now with your eval of Jordan Love?
I still think there's more good in that, like the areas he has to his game that are the plus areas are like the hardest to coach, right? I think like his playmaking ability, the eyes, like the way he's down, is always looking downfield to come to short, like, and the way he can navigate pressure and still attack down the football field, I think are all like real high end traits, like real traits that are tough to fake that I think will translate in time. One, he just needs the reps. He needs to play a bunch of games. Two, he needs some little help from his supporting cast. And three, he just needs to like not press, not put it all on his own shoulders, because I think he does a little bit too much of that. And especially like at the end of game situations this past week, most notably. But I still believe, because, we're here starting off the show lamenting all the mistakes from his wide receivers. I still think as they grow together, the consistency from everyone is going to improve, whether it's him, whether it's this young offensive line, or whether it's this young receiving core.
Okay. So there has been this discussion on defense. I know we spent a lot of time talking about the offense, but whenever I talk about the talent on this Packers defense, I get pushback from some people, Twitter, but like, you never know, about, well, if they're not good at a certain point, if the defense can't coalesce at a certain point, do we have to start looking at the talent? Given your background as an evaluator, where do you stand on the talent that the Packers have? I continue to believe they have a lot of talent and they're not maximizing that talent. But I do think there is a reasonable case to be made. Like, hey, at a certain point, you got to do it. It can't all be on the coaches. The players have to do the thing too. So where do you stand on that?
I think the talent's there. Truthfully, like this could be, should be a maybe not top 5 defense, but it should at worst be a top 10 defense. If you're stacked up talent across, all defenses in the NFL, they're top 10 in the NFL in terms of talent. I do truly believe that. And I think like the positions they're weakest are also positions you can like kind of survive being weakest, whether it's at safety. I think obviously being their weakest link right now, but like it is there. I do think they're just playing kind of a brand of football that's going to lead itself to being kind of a boring static defense. That's going to it's truly like is what it is. Like they're not going to look atrocious ever, I don't think, but I don't think they're playing a brand of defense that's built to be suffocating. And they're just not even attempting to shoot for that top 3, top 5. I just watched them. I watched a bunch of tape over the weekend of the Kansas City Chiefs defense and just kind of like the dichotomy in terms of very similar personnel in the secondary in terms of the skill sets that they have at like the corner position, yet just vastly different defensive philosophies. And you have the Chiefs have second in points per game defensively, and the Packers kind of not at that level just yet. So I think there's an in-between in terms of just going full on passive coverages versus just being a little more, using your personnel a little more diversely, shall I say, in terms of just how they're deployed.
Yeah, and the Chiefs are a great example because I just got finished watching the Broncos Chiefs game, which what a slog that was. But one of the reasons was the Chiefs defense is really good, and I think if you put them player for player against the Packers, like Chris Jones is probably the best player on either team. After that, did the Packers have like the next 5 guys? Like it's one of those things, and so it's I feel like we keep having this Joe Barry conversation. I don't like having it because I just feel the whole conversation about jobs is kind of I just don't love it. But at a certain point, like that's that, and also, but it reflects too on your coach. Like Matt LaFleur is still ultimately in charge here. I don't know when this starts to land a little more squarely on his shoulders.
I think it truly should. I mean, it's more where my frustration would lie because I do think
what the Jets did without their 2 starting corners, and they took it to an Eagles team where it's just like there's no, like the Packers would lose that game by 25 points.
Yeah, and it's like you go to, just the best head coaches around the NFL. They have their hands in both sides of the football, right? Yeah. Like you can't just be a guy who just passes the buck on one full side of the ball, right? I get that you're the play caller, like you're the offensive coordinator, like that is your focus, that's your bread and butter. But like even Kyle Shanahan in San Francisco is kind of like their de facto DC too. Like he has his fingerprints all over that defense. They don't change much year to year, despite going 3 different defense coordinators, because he's still the guy ultimately in charge of it. So I do think that is the bigger thing, is that like if you know offensive football, you know defensive football too. Matt LaFleur needs to get a little bit more proactive on that side of football.
Okay, it is early, understanding, but I have started to see some of the mock drafts come out for Packers fans, and I think this is an easy year to do it too, because you're like, okay, if you feel like you need a quarterback, there might be like 5 or 6 guys to get pretty excited about. If you need an offensive tackle, which the Packers might, there are a handful of guys that you could get really excited about. If you feel like they need that alpha number 1 receiver, there are a handful of guys you can get really excited about. Like this seems to be lining up well for the Packers. If you could just pluck one of these guys from like, let's call it the top 15 and put him on this Packers roster. Okay, Caleb Williams, maybe even Drake May, we just should set to the side. Who is it?
To me, it's Cooper DeJean, Iowa corner / maybe safeties, whatever you want to use him as. I think he's kind of perfectly what they would need, probably in that defense, just kind of how it's schemed right now. I think he'd be great as their slot. So I think he's 6'1", 207, high-end athlete. He plays outside for Iowa, but like versatile enough. He's a great tackler. He's great ball skills. Just a guy who can you can be like Brian Branch immediately for them day one in the slot and just be an impact player there. So that's the guy I'd probably want the most on the Packers. And now they'll obviously keep using first-round picks on defense. That would make like 9 first-rounders now on the defensive side of the ball if they did draft him. But like that's kind of still is where you're kind of still hurting. And like you draft another young wide receiver, and this is a good wide receiver class, but you can probably find some guys into day 2 as well. But if we're going actually wide receiver, Keon Coleman is the guy I'd probably want. And some guy with ball skills is probably the one guy I'd add to this wide receiving core. So I'll say those two. Those are the 2 guys I'd want.
The Coleman name is going to be one that comes up over and over. And I think the Packers, depending on how he tests, they're probably going to have to be pretty bad for that to be in the cards for them. But we'll see.
It's a good class, like overall.
It's early too. And so a lot can happen between now and April. I will point out, I mentioned this on Twitter. I got to give you your flowers for it. When I had you on a couple years ago and I said, pick one of these guys to be a Packer. You said Tyler Smith. That was a little bit of a off the wall pick at the time. He's turned into a hell of a football player in Dallas. And so just wanted to give you your props on that. Let my audience know all the stuff, and including Renner ranks, that they can find all the stuff that you're doing.
What was that? Oh, sorry.
That's all right. I'll cut it. Just plug yourself.
Okay. Yeah. Renner ranks on where you get podcasts, or what are we supposed to say on the Locked On Network? Any social?
Yeah. For free, wherever you get podcasts.
For free, wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe for free. And then on Twitter, you find me at Mike Renner _ and you can find all my written work, all my draft rankings and stuff are on themessenger.com. So check it out there.
You'll get the lines down, Mike. I promise.
Yeah. Hopefully. There's a lot of them, dude.
All right. Thanks to Mike for joining the show. Awesome to have him back and have us here as part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Of course, your team every day. We'll be back tomorrow, Lily Zhao, for a Zhao You Doing Wednesday, back on our regular schedule with a regular schedule of the week. Follow me on Twitter, Peter _Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts. Wherever you find podcasts, you will find Locked On Packers. And anytime you want to come hang out with us live, like we will be after this game on Sunday evening, go subscribe to our YouTube page so you can stay Locked On Packers.